wires leading from the new cubicle and plug them into where the old wires used to be, or program the computer to tell it that that network address and services in person are now associated with this pair of wires instead of that pair of wires. Contrast this to voice over IP. With voice over IP, the telephone is an IP device plugged onto a LAN, and it runs a protocol called the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And this is the protocol we use to dynamically assign IP addresses to computers. So what happens when you want to change cubicles, you just pick your telephone up, walk over to the other cubicle and plug your phone into the LAN jack in the new cubicle, and your IP telephone runs the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol and gets a new IP address and then automatically registers with the gatekeeper. In other words, the moves and changes happen all on their own. And you start thinking, well, how often do people move in your organization? Well, it's at least once a year you change cubicles, and in the traditional world we have to have a technician go do that, which costs about $100, whether it's an internal technician or it's a technician from the phone company. That costs money. All of a sudden it's free with voice over IP. And besides the user's services moving all on their own, also management is much more easily done, because these voice over IP systems are by definition connected to an IP network, which means that a manager can be sitting at one location and can go over the IP network and access the control interface for a gatekeeper or a gateway or a call manager and manage the system remotely. So it's both users plus management is now independent of location. Another example is we can get away from the tyranny of PBXs. In other words, not by dedicated purpose hardware and proprietary software running on this dedicated purpose hardware to be our telephone switch, but to buy general purpose computing platforms and run software on them to do the telephone switching functions. And it's going to be cheaper because it's general purpose hardware instead of dedicated hardware. Another advantage of voice over IP is that we don't need to buy expensive telephones anymore. The idea would be you have your IP telephone on the desk and then you have your desktop computer, so you don't need to have a little user interface on the telephone that lets you, program in call forwarding or see caller ID or anything like that. You could just get a bare bones telephone, if you will, and use the human machine interface on your desktop computer to do call forwarding or caller ID or all of those fun things. Another advantage of voice over IP that you'll read about is that we can use expensive telephones, and we can get an integrated telephone that allows you to surf the web and read email and talk on the phone all at the same time. So essentially replace your desktop computer by using an expensive telephone. Another advantage of voice over IP might be that we eliminate the telephone altogether, and then the users could have little headsets with a speaker here and a microphone on a little boom, and they plug that into their computer, and then they've got a soft telephone, which is a little thing on their screen. If they want to dial a telephone number, they click the person's name if they've already dialed it, or to dial a telephone number that they haven't dialed before, they could click what looks like a telephone keypad on the screen of their computer, and these are called soft phones. So 3 advantages of voice over IP. We could get cheap telephones and use the desktop to do call management. We could get expensive telephones and replace the desktop PC, or we could eliminate the telephone altogether. As you can start to see, there are lots of different choices here. One other advantage of voice over IP that's worth mentioning is call centers. Over the last few years, there's been quite a progression to self-serve via the web. Just think of buying a plane ticket, for example. You're much more likely these days to go to a web server and type in your flight information that you're looking for and get a whole list of the different airlines and flights and prices and so forth than you are to call an 800 number and get a person to essentially do the same thing and then speak it to you over the telephone. The problem comes in is when you get all the way down to having selected your flights via this web server, but you've got a question, like you want to put it in a booking class where you can use an upgrade certificate, but it doesn't say anything about that on this web server you're using. So what do you have to do? Pick up the phone and dial 1-800-UNITED-1 and go through their whole interactive voice response system, then talk to a person, tell them the same information that you typed in on the web, have them redo everything you've done until finally you can get to the point where they can help you with your problem. Wouldn't it be nice if on this web page that's being displayed on your screen, once you get all the way down, you've chosen your flights and everything, but you want to select a booking class and there's no way to do that, you could click a button and it would connect you to the call center and you could speak to the person, but also they would end up with a copy of the same web page that you're looking at, and they might have some additional features that they could move it through another few steps without having to tell them all of the same information. Essentially, they recreate your session. So what we're going to see going forward is that by having voice in IP and data in IP all integrated together in the call center, it's going to make it a lot easier to merge together these two ideas of self-service via the web versus traditional talk to me over the phone type customer service, and bring a lot of efficiencies to the latter. Okay, so that's a brief run through of some of the most commonly touted advantages of voice over IP. We're going to take a closer look at some of these and look at the front and the back of these stories, the pros and the possibly hidden cons that you would want to think about before you jump into this with both feet. The biggest purported advantage of voice over IP is that it's going to be cheaper, you're going to save money on long distance phone calls. And that may well be true. It might not end up being true because, as we said in the previous chapter, there isn't a whole lot of economy to get in terms of the actual efficiency of using the trunk circuits, because those are more or less free in a lot of applications because the wholesale cost of long distance to carriers is pretty close to zero these days. Where we would see voice over IP being cheaper is to places where it isn't close to zero already to make a phone call. In other words, not domestic phone calls inside Canada or the United States, international phone calls to places where the local exchange carrier adds $1.50 access charge per minute onto any phone call, regardless of who's carrying it. We might bypass the local exchange carrier and have your voice happen over data circuits, and so it's not regulated, as we discussed before. Another place that we'll see voice over IP right away is with prepaid phone cards. And this is essentially a reseller providing you with long distance service. This reseller purchases capacity from a facilities-based carrier. Facilities-based means they have their own physical stuff in place. So this company purchases capacity from them, and then they have to set up a prepaid platform. And what happens is they then sell these little cards. It has an 800 number on the back and an account number. So if you want to make a phone call, you dial the 800 number, which gets you to their prepaid platform, and then you have to type in your account number, and then you type in the number of where you want to go, and then the prepaid platform makes an outgoing phone call and bridges your incoming phone call to the outgoing one. The reason why it's done this way is because they have to have the capability to cut the phone call off when you run out of money on your calling card. Now, a reseller is leasing capacity from a carrier and then competing with that same carrier to try to make some money. And this is a pretty spongy business model, because the idea of leasing capacity from somebody and then competing directly with them to sell at retail, you're at a disadvantage right from the start. So there's always pressure with phone cards to try to figure out a way to make some money. One way is with extremely confusing billing plans and minimum charges and service fees and monthly charges, and having a minimum amount left on the card in order to initiate a new phone call. And if you take a look at the fine print on a lot of phone cards, you'll see all of this fun stuff. Another way to get some margin would be, especially when we're talking about international